Welcome to the Shift Report, the podcast from EMcentric and the EMcentric Foundation. EMcentric is the go-to information and resources hub designed exclusively for the emergency medicine community. We regularly host key leaders from the field who share their insights and experience. Our goal is to inform our listeners and to encourage you to use what you learn to improve your practice and improve yourself. To learn more, please visit us at emcentric.org. Today's episode is sponsored by Lotus Clinician Wellbeing. Lotus Clinician Wellbeing provides consulting services designed to prioritize clinician wellness in order to provide the best care for their patients. Lotus Clinician Wellbeing supports healthcare professionals with personalized coaching and consulting services for groups and individuals in areas such as career development, leadership, burnout prevention, practice management, and more. For more information, visit lotusclinicianwellbeing.com. Today, we welcome Sam Ashoo. Dr. Ashoo lives and works in Florida. He has a long and distinguished emergency medicine career, and he's now devoted to informatics and education, including work at EB Medicine, a leading provider of emergency medicine CME, among a number of other things he does, including hosting his own podcast. He'll tell us about that and more today. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
Great, thanks. And we'll talk about your podcast too as we go along. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today at the Shift Report. You spent a long time in clinical medicine and in leadership in clinical operations in busy emergency departments. Tell us about that work and what led you to that, and then how you over time transitioned into what you're doing now.
Of course. Yeah. Emergency medicine is a fantastic career. You gotta love it. I don't think there's anything out there in medicine that is similar. And I had the wonderful opportunity to engage in clinical practice for right around 20 years after residency. So residency was in Orlando at Orlando Regional Medical Center, a fantastic facility with some wonderful attending physicians, got a great education there. And then in Tallahassee, I spent 20 years in clinical practice and also in administration. So had the opportunity to become medical director and help lead the department for about 5.5 years, and then did some traveling and consulting and work with a coding and billing company. So the wonderful thing about emergency medicine is it lends itself very well to using your skills in other careers. And I had a really, really good time enjoying expanding on the career and using those skills kind of in the periphery of emergency medicine while I was working in clinical practice.
So the medical director, before we got to get into what you're doing now,
Yeah.
you spent time as medical director, and that's something that I think many people in emergency medicine either aim toward or sometimes get asked to do when maybe that wasn't something they were considering, but in a group, it becomes obvious that they need a medical director and somebody needs to do it. What advice do you give from your experience as medical director for someone who maybe gets tagged for that job or is aiming at that job?
Yeah. I think if you're working in a place that is tagging people for that job, then that needs to be reconsidered. To be a medical director and to be a good one, you need to want to do the job because it's just as much human resources as it is emergency medicine. And it's not clinical, but you need to have that clinical understanding, and then you got to manage your partners. And honestly, some of the most difficult people you'll deal with are not consultants, but your fellow partners. Just approach any one of them and ask them to change the way they do something, and you'll get the slick. Like, who are you, and why are you asking me to change the way that I address this particular issue? And so, I think if you're working in a place that's tagging people, that's probably old, a very old way of doing things, and maybe it's just a figurehead kind of role, and somebody needs to have the title. But if you're actually having to manage your partners and PAs and nurse practitioners, then it should be someone who actually wants to do the job. And if you're seeking and wanting to do the job, then good for you. It's a great role, and it really broadened my scope of understanding of emergency medicine and really helped me appreciate what it's like to try and steer an entire group of physicians who are all boarded in the same thing and all doing the same thing every single day. And honestly, if you think that's a challenge, then just think about our colleagues at something like the AMA or at a national level trying to steer multiple different specialties in a direction. It really gives you an appreciation for what it's like to lead and manage your partners.
Right. And I think we'll delve into in future episodes the management of emergency medicine because you're right, there's HR management, which I think people in any industry find difficult, and managing budgets and managing expectations and managing quality, which we talk about a fair amount, but aren't so good at measuring
We
sometimes.
don't like that word.
No, we don't like that word, but it's a key word in all
It
of what
is.
we do. So,
Absolutely.
an important part of management. Now, as you expanded your roles, you delved into a field called clinical informatics.
Mhm.
And we hear a lot about clinical informatics. There's even board certification now in
Yeah.
informatics, which is very important. And I think when people who aren't informatics experts think about it, they think about optimizing how they figure out how the EHR works and delving into that, which we all struggle with anyway. But there's more to it than that. Talk a little bit about the field of clinical informatics, how it's growing, and its importance in what we do now.
Yeah. Yeah, informatics is just as varied as emergency medicine. You can have a emergency physician who's working in a rural place seeing 3 patients a day and someone working in a, quaternary referral center who's seeing the sickest of the sick and running an ICU bordering patients in their emergency department. It's a huge variation in practice, and informatics is quite the same. It's a wonderful field. I came to it through I should say I came to board certification in it through the practice track. So yes, you can go and get fellowship trained in informatics, and I came through the practice track several years ago when I was actually the medical director shortly after I had stepped away from that role because of all of the informatics work I was having to do in assisting our practice move from paper charting and paper ordering and paper documentation into the electronic world of Cerner at the time. And so I spent a lot of time helping with that transition and the setup of our practice and learned about informatics that way. And, for me, informatics is just translational. It is how do I relay to the programmers, the designers, the people who have access to make changes in our EHRs or in whatever system we're using, the changes that we need made so that we can do our clinical jobs. And every time someone came to me with a frustration or a problem, going, "Hey, I keep running across this problem, and this is poorly designed," I'd say, "Yeah, I completely agree." And we would then go back to our designers and our programmers and our team and try and make some changes. And so that's how I stumbled into informatics. But I love tech. So I'm an early adopter, and I wear that flag proudly. And so I love being a beta tester. I love giving people feedback about their systems, and with that comes, of course, the maximal frustration when a system has been poorly designed and I wasn't involved in the initial stages, and now I have to use it. And that's not just in medicine, but in anything, in an email app or in a messaging app, or when the latest OS comes out and I'm having to update something. Uh, Little things frustrate me when they're poorly designed, and I think the field of informatics has grown because our adoption of systems that are electronic based has blown and tremendously increased in the last 10 years. And with it came a need for someone to be at the meeting space between those who create the systems and those who use the systems. And that's the niche where I see informatics, at least the part of it that I take a role in. There are informaticists all over the country in doing everything from programming to testing to developing new products. But for me, it's more about how do I make the shift and the actual clinical work easier by designing a system well so that it supports the user. And if it doesn't, then how do we fix that?
Yeah, thank you for your work on that. It's very important, and we have certainly gone from paper charting to electronics. There are many of our listeners who've never written on a paper chart.
The good old and bad old days.
Yes, exactly, which we remember well. And we have the term downtime, which occasionally takes us to paper.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting to watch people fumble their way through that and realize how dependent we are on the electronic systems when
Hmm.
there's even the smallest glitch at times,
Yeah.
and how things slow down. Now, education is also one of your passions and one of your areas of work. The need for education sometimes frustrates our colleagues that
Hmm.
we went through medical school and residency and board certification, and there are lots of controversies, in fact, in how that updating occurs. But the fact is, clinical science is changing rapidly all around us and is requiring us to change the things that we do at the bedside, even for somebody who's not particularly tech enabled or advanced. The world is changing around us, and it's important to keep up with that. You work with a team at EB Medicine, which is one of a number of education providers in and around emergency medicine. Tell us about your work with that group and how you go about educating our physicians on advances in emergency medicine.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're talking about continuing medical education. These are practicing physicians who have now been completed their residency and are ready to enter practice or have been in practice. EB Medicine is a wonderful company. My relationship with them started in 2019, and before that, I was a subscriber. But my relationship in helping foster medical education started with them in 2019 when I took over the EMplify podcast, and then since then, it's grown. It's kind of blossomed. The thing that attracted me, I think, to EB medicine. And emergency medicine practice, that's their general EM journal, was the clinical pathways. So since the day I entered residency, it has always been a struggle to take a piece of information and file it somewhere where I could get back to it when I needed it. And, from the days of carrying a pocketbook or a small ring binder where you could slip in notes, fast forward to the days of like the Palm Pilot and the rudimentary texts that we used to input into these things, and then moving forward into the iPhone and having access to the internet from my pocket all of the time and storing notes in something like Evernote or some text processor. It's always been a struggle. Where can I put this information? And during my time as a medical director, it was where can I put this information so that every one of my partners can also have access to it. And what I quickly learned was that my organization in keeping those notes was beneficial to my partners. So I would just put those notes somewhere that was accessible to everyone else and always introduce it as I need this for my medical practice. I'm not saying you're a bad doctor, but I need this and I need to know how I can access it when I'm on shift. So I'm just going to share it with you and you can use it or not. Then I went on to start a website, and then COVID hit, and I was putting out COVID newsletters and sharing them with my colleagues through ASEP, and eventually I fostered this relationship with EB Medicine, and the EB Medicine is filled with clinical pathways. So there are the three journals: one for emergency medicine, one for pediatric emergency medicine, and one for urgent care. And every one of those publications, who's written by a board certified physician, has a pathway in it, and the pathway for me is kind of the ideal meeting space uh, of medical research and clinical practice, because it's boiled down to a step-by-step progression that you can follow. A lot of people don't like pathways. They think this is cookbook medicine and I'm forced to go down this way, this route. But honestly, I disagree. I don't think cookbook is a good metaphor for a pathway in medicine. And sorry, this is a long-winded answer for you,
No,
but
no, this is a very important subject to go into because I think people do get frustrated about being told you need to do this a certain way
yeah.
that might be a variance from the way they want to do it, but in fact is probably the best thing for the patient.
Yeah, and if the pathway you're looking at is grounded in medical evidence and good medical evidence, then I think that pathway has a lot to offer you in your clinical practice. For me, it even offloads some of that information. So instead of having to go and search the primary literature in order to know what the next step should be, someone's already done that work for me. They've graded it to tell me what the level of evidence is, and they've provided me with the pathway, and I can offload that information and then fill it back up with something that's more relevant to the clinical scenario with the patient in front of me. And I'm not cooking something. I'm not making meatloaf, right? Patients are not food. The ultimate answer isn't going to be the same every single time. Unlike when you're cooking and you're trying to reproduce something exactly, I'm not trying to reproduce something exactly with every patient encounter. I'm trying to help a human being who's sitting in front of me, and some people use that as the argument against clinical pathways, but I think it's an argument for clinical pathways. I say, okay, you have a lot of tailoring that you've got to do to fit this patient, and that's going to require a lot of mental energy from you. And you don't need to spend that mental energy thinking about what the latest research was on a specific topic. Just pull up the pathway and take a look at it. And then we can see how it applies to your patient scenario. It's not going to be a perfect fit. You're going to have to tailor it, but the clinical pathway helps relieve a lot of that mental burden. And EB medicine does a fantastic job with those pathways. There are hundreds there over the 25 years that the periodical has been in existence, and EB medicine's been around. And that's how I fell in love with EB medicine, and that's where the relationship came in. And what I really wanted to do was to help bring those clinical pathways to the bedside and say, okay, I know it's in a journal. I may have it on paper. I may have to go to a library somewhere and look it up. And in the digital era, I can go to the website and look it up. But how do I specifically get the pathway that is most pertinent to my clinical scenario in my hands while I'm standing here at the bedside, or just outside the room, so I can read through it and see what applies? And that's where I fell in love with EB medicine, and where I tend to spend all of my time now. Uh, I really want to bring those pathways to people at the bedside, and they're all written by our partners, our academic and non-academic partners who do a great deal of research on our behalf in order to help support them. And so I think it's a fantastic product, and that's the work that I do for EB medicine now.
And that's great. I think pathways are important, whether they come from ED medicine or some other provider or your own internal medical directors and clinical leadership, and in a hospital in collaboration with other specialties like critical care or cardiology or surgery or whomever it may be. Those things are important. And I think as we learn also related to safety and quality in other
Mhm.
industries, like the aviation industry is commonly
Yeah.
talked about as uh, trying to be error free. And that's what we're really trying to do. We're trying to be error free and provide the best clinical service, realizing that every patient's a little bit different and there might be something different you have to do, but the pathways are important to follow, and having access to them is great. So we thank you for that.
I will add also that I still have these little pocket notes I made for my colleagues about how we did things at our institution. So the clinical pathway is really just the medicine part of it. It doesn't necessarily answer the institutional part of the question. So you may have somebody with a massive upper GI bleed, and in your institution, you may have interventional radiology available to embolize a gastric artery, or you may not. And the first call may go to interventional radiology unless it's a weekend or an evening, in which case it may be a GI, or if the GI can't handle those things, then it has to be a transfer. And so every institution we work at as emergency physicians has these subtle differences. And part of that directorship and moving forward was building these little pocket notes about, okay, this is the scenario. Now we're just stepping away from the clinical medicine for 1 second and just talking about how is this done at our institution? Well, what day of the week is it? What time is it? This is who you call first, and then this is who you call second. Or you got a massive PE, you want to give them catheter-directed thrombolysis, or you want to do a direct removal of a clot. Are you calling your cardiology colleagues? Are you calling your pulmonology colleagues? Are you calling your interventional radiology colleagues? It varies depending on your institution. And it's infinitely helpful to not have to memorize all of that stuff and to just pull up your phone and go, I'm focused on the patient in front of me. I'm worried about the medicine and the stability of this patient. Now, just tell me who it is I'm supposed to call. And then not to have a confrontation with the person on the other end of the line who goes, why are you calling me? I go, I'm calling you because this is what it says in my protocol for the institution, and it's signed by your chief and my chief. So you're the guy, right? So that is part of the process as well. So those pathways, of course, the EB medicine side are all clinical. They're all evidence based, but those pathways can be institutional, just like you said, from your director or your department chair.
Right. As an example, we all have examples of these. And a place where I have worked clinically for a number of years, I can vividly recall the prior days of people who had to go to the cath lab for STEMIs, for ST elevation MIs, and we had a collection of cardiologists, each of whom wanted something slightly different, in how much heparin was given, or how the aspirin was given, or whatever it was. And it took months, but I'll give complete credit to my clinical director, who eventually worked out that all the cardiologists would accept doing it one way. So we only had to write one set of orders to get somebody to the cath lab. And that seems obvious now, but I'm sure many of our colleagues have faced the same situation, and in standardizing it improved the operations and improved patient care too, because there's no opportunity for error in those.
Yeah. And
And
that's a difficult process, honestly, like getting those specialties to agree and getting them to come to a consensus on what medication. You'd think it would be pretty simple. It's a STEMI. Like, how many things can I give you before you get to the cath lab? Well, there's probably 15 things that I have to give you, if you include things like saline. And the dosing should be standardized, but some want heparin, some want Lovenox, some want something else, some want the Plavix load, some want to wait and see what the coronary artery disease burden is, and whether or not you might have to go to bypass before we give you the Plavix. It's just, there's so much there, that it can't be physician specific if you have more than one physician who's going to take call. So yeah, I agree. That's a fantastic example.
now you've grown from your work in EV medicine, and you mentioned your podcast. Tell us about the podcast you're doing now, and your experience with them. You're obviously on our podcast, and we appreciate that. But there are many from which you can learn. What is your focus, and how are you growing that now?
So the podcast is called EMplify. That's EMplify. It's kind of amplify, but for emergency medicine. And it was started actually by two emergency physicians before I even joined EB medicine. So I took over in 2019 after the podcast had already been around for about a year and a half. And they had done a good job. The podcast was focused on taking one of the articles published by EB Medicine every month and having a conversation about it. And when I assumed it in 2019, I started interviewing the authors and every month putting out an episode. And then COVID hit, and I started interviewing other people we had access to. So I remember my most memorable interview is probably with an emergency physician in Italy at the time that COVID hit there, before it had arrived stateside. And I specifically remember telling him, it's almost like I'm looking into a crystal ball for what my future is going to be. And then it hit the States, and everything he was experiencing with massive patient overload, under resourced, people boarding in the ER, running out of ventilators, all of that stuff they were experiencing in Italy that just occurred stateside. And so I had the opportunity to interview people like that, and that's where the podcast is today. So once a month, we'll put out something clinical based on one of the journals published by EB Medicine, and I try once a month to have a special guest on to talk about something peripherally related to emergency medicine that I think will be of interest to listeners.
Great, thank you. Very clinically focused, and certainly can recommend it. And we'll put in our show notes how to find that and how to listen to you, on a regular basis. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Now, we talk about wellness and growth in emergency medicine. We have had a number of podcast guests who are focusing on wellness. In your various experiences, including being a medical director and now helping to educate physicians, what are your thoughts? And this is sort of a generic question. What are your thoughts on the growth of the specialty and the struggles that our colleagues are facing related to boarding, which you've mentioned, and burnout and overload, and how to enjoy the best of emergency medicine while managing what is sometimes the worst of our specialty.
Wow, that's a totally softball question there, Till. I mean,
Yeah,
easy to answer. Okay, so let's start with one of my thoughts about the practice of emergency medicine today. It's hard. It is harder than it was when I started, which was already harder than it was when the previous generation of physicians before me started. I remember my first job out of residency, I sat across from someone who had already been in his career for 35 years. And he could remember the first day he entered emergency medicine, writing on a piece of paper. The billing sheets were fill in your charge, just write a number, and that's what we're going to bill. There was no documentation burden. There was no what did you order and what test. It was just put in a number, and it was universally like $250, $300 charge. It was just some physician charge he made up, and that's what they used. Uh, and the day that I started, we were migrating into some kind of standardized documentation, and he was lamenting what it used to be like when it was just a blank piece of paper. And so the practice has certainly changed. And today, if you're working in a busy tertiary care center, the patient population is different. They're much sicker. The amount of medical care they require in the emergency department is way more than it used to be. And my colleague who's now retired, who had a 40-year career, remembers the days where someone would come in with chest pain. He would pick up the phone, call a cardiologist, and say, "So and so's here with chest pain. I'm going to write an admission order." Da, 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 done, and the patient just goes upstairs. And that was the extent of the ED evaluation. That and an EKG. I'll
Mhm.
order the chest X-ray. I'm not going to have it read and done by the time they get admitted. Uh, and now, emergency medicine is not just treating the critically ill, but it's an outpatient diagnostic center. People don't know what's going on. They come to the ED. Primary care physicians don't know what to do with a patient. They send them to the ED, and we're expected to do all of that. The pressure is high, and you still got to see lots of patients and see more patients, and uh, the clinical practice is exceedingly difficult. That it's only getting more difficult over time. It's not getting easier, and I think that certainly has some part to play in physician burnout. And then, what's my recipe for maintaining the joy of emergency medicine? My personal recipe for the 20 years I spent in clinical practice was to do something other than just clinical practice that was related to emergency medicine. So I love being on podcasts and interviewing people. I love being the emergency medicine director for my department. And I really enjoyed the administrative side. I learned more about billing and coding, and I learned more about the electronic health record portion of emergency medicine. All of that kept me in the practice, but not necessarily at the bedside. And there is a huge offload in mental energy when you're doing something other than just treating a patient. So you can be in emergency medicine, but not at the bedside. You're not giving up your career or somehow posing as a physician by doing those kinds of things. Those are important roles. So I'd encourage people to find hobbies that also encompass emergency medicine. Uh, and that's aside from, of course, making sure you're spending time with your family and having hobbies outside the hospital and taking care of yourself personally. But I do think that the clinical practice has gotten a lot harder and is a lot more intense. So, I didn't spend more hours at the end of my career than I did in the beginning part in a shift, but those hours were way more intense by the end, and that takes its toll for sure.
Thank you very much. And I recognize that was not the softball question, I promise, but that's an important answer and important perspective for many. So thank you for that. Remind us again how we can find your podcast and where to find it online and where to find you.
Yeah. So the podcast is EMplify, EMplify. You can just pull up your podcast app, whatever it is, and search for it. It's on everything. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever else you listen and consume podcasts. Uh, and You can find me, well, you can find me on EMcentric. You can come message me there,
Yes.
right? And you can find me on LinkedIn. And I have a social media presence in pretty much most platforms. So, direct messaging me just about anywhere and I'll reply. But I do spend most of my time at LinkedIn.
Great, thank you, and thanks, Sam, for joining us today, and thank for sharing your very honest experiences and perspective on emergency medicine.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us in this installment of our EMcentric podcast series, The Shift Report. And special thanks to Dr. Sam Ashoo for sharing his important insights.